Okay, we are in 2 Kings chapter 5, and that will be on page 311 if you're using one of our OCF Bibles. We have been in these historical books, and they've been a bit of a challenge at times, as it just takes a little bit more digging to mine the jewels of the gospel from 1 Kings and 2 Kings and on and on. But this passage today is one of those that it is right there. It is an engaging story. It's a fun story. And so we're going to have a takeaway here today for pretty much every person in this room. So let's jump in. I will read the text and we'll fill in some blanks on your outlines and see what we can learn from this wonderful story. 2 Kings chapter 5, starting with verse 1. Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria, was a great man with his master and in high favor, because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. He was a mighty man of valor, but he was a leper. Now the Syrians on one of their raids had carried off a little girl from the land of Israel, and she worked in the service of Naaman's wife. Here's the drill. Here's our map. Here's Israel, and this would be Syria. It's called Aram on the map, but this would be Syria. And so the Syrians, God was giving them victory, which is really strange. The Lord, you'd expect in the Bible, the Lord gave his people Israel victory. But it says the Lord gave Syria victory. And the reason is, at this point in Israel's history, Israel has turned their back on God, and they're basically apostate, and God is using foreign nations like Israel Syria, Aram, to discipline his people. And so, as is characteristic of ancient warfare, the Syrians come down, they trash Israel, and they raid and take all these people captive, slaves back up into Syria. And so the captives are taken from Israel. They're up in Syria, and one of these captives is this little girl. And it says there in verse 3, she said to her mistress, "Would that my Lord were with the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." So Naaman, this big-shot commander, went in and told his Lord, "Thus and so spoke the girl from the land of Israel." And the king of Syria said, "Go now, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel." So he went, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels, and 10 changes of clothing. That is a boatload of stuff. Verse 6, and he brought the letter to the king of Israel, which read, quote, "When this letter reaches you, know that I've sent to you Naaman, my servant, that you may cure him of his leprosy." This Syrian king apparently figured any prophet worth his salt would be associated with the king's court in Israel, and that's why he sends him to the king of Israel and not directly to Elisha. Verse 7, and when the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes and said, "Am I God to kill and to make alive, that this man sends word to me to cure a man of his leprosy? Only consider and see how he's seeking a quarrel with me." But when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, he went to the king, saying, "Why have you torn your clothes? Let Naaman come now to me, that he may know that there is a prophet in Israel." So Naaman came with his horses and chariots and stood at the door of Elisha's house. And Elisha sent a messenger out to him, saying, "Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored, and you shall be clean." What? Like that's going to do me any good? Verse 11, well, but Naaman was angry and went away, saying, "Behold, I thought he would surely come out to me and stand and call upon the name of the Lord and wave his hand over the place and cure the leper. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean?" So he turned away in a rage. But his servants, who had a little more sense, came to him and said, and I'm going to retranslate this verse kind of like it's in the NRSV because I think it's a better translation. "My father, is it really that big of a deal that the prophet has asked you to do? Will you not do it? Has he actually said to you, wash and be clean? In other words, give it a try. It's not that Big of a deal. Verse 14, so Naaman went down and dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan according to the word of the man of God, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. Isn't it a great story? Gets even better. Check out his response. Then Naaman returned to the man of God, he and all his company, and he came and stood before him and said, behold, I know now that there is no God in all the earth except in Israel. So accept now a present from your servant. But Elisha said, as the Lord lives before whom I stand, I will receive none. And Naaman urged him to take it, but Elisha refused. Then verse 17, then Naaman said, if not, please let there be given to your servant 2 mule loads of earth. For from now on your servant will not offer burnt offering or sacrifice to any God but Yahweh, the true Lord. What in the world's going on? This guy wants, what is he going to do, plant a garden? He wants a pile of dirt from Israel. Well, the reason he wants this is God, Yahweh, is tied to his land. This is a holy land. And this guy's so sold out to Yahweh, so sold out to God, that he wants to take a piece of that real estate back to Syria and plop it down so he can worship God faithfully on the Holy Land back home. I mean, his life has been utterly transformed. A lot of great stuff in this passage. Take out your outlines. Let's fill in some blanks. I don't know about you, in my circles I run in, there are 3 kinds of people. There are people who love Jesus. We're going to call them today Jesus followers. And there are people who are not followers of Jesus, but they're interested in spiritual things. I would call them God seekers. And then there are people who could care less about spiritual things, okay? Now, there's probably not too many people in category 3 here today with us, unless your spouse drug you to church. But there are always here at OCF people who are committed to Jesus, Jesus followers, and there are God seekers. And we welcome them. And so today we're going to look on the outline of what this passage has for those of us who are Jesus followers and what it has for those of us who are God seekers. I spent a year of my life as a God seeker. From the time I was 22 years old to the time I was 23 years old, trying all kinds of different rivers to dip in and find out my healing, until I finally found the Jordan River of Jesus at the end of my search. So I have a warm spot in my heart for people who are genuinely seeking after God. But let's start with those of us who are Jesus followers, okay? Many of you, as I'm looking around, my OCF brothers and sisters, much to learn from this passage. The first thing we note is that your life situation is a strategic opportunity for God to work his wonders in the lives of others. Your life situation is a strategic opportunity for God to work his wonders in the lives of others. I think I hear a sound system, is that right? So I can stop yelling at you guys, all right? Okay. Look back at verses 1 and 2, where it talks about the Syrians on one of their raids had carried off a little girl from the land of Israel, and she worked in the service of Naaman the leper's wife. The life situation of this little girl, folks, was no accident. It was a strategic opportunity for God to work his wonders in someone else's life, and it was an opportunity that God had arranged. It was no accident. It says right at the beginning of the passage, the Lord had given victory to Israel. Now, what that means is for you and I, our life situation is no accident. Our life situations are strategic opportunities for God to work his wonders in the lives of those in our circles of influence. It might be your coworkers, it might be your neighbors, it might be your friends, it might be people in your family, it might be even fellow hobbyists. If you happen to be part of a hobby that involves social interaction with others, there's just a variety of ways to think about how strategically you and I are placed. And maybe to help you kind of get your head around this, let's reverse this whole thing. And for those of you who became Christians as adults, like I did, think back to how God strategically placed Christians in your life during the time you were a God seeker. Boy, I can look back. During that year, I was crying out to God, if you're there, reveal yourself to me. And I was in a rock band, And it was the only rock band I'd ever been in where there was a guy who was a Christian, an on-fire, committed Christian who played guitar in this rock band. And I remember asking him after rehearsal, Gary, could we go out for coffee and you could tell me about God? And so there was a strategic place that God had put Gary and for me as I was along the way in this pilgrimage. And those of you who became Christians as adults, you didn't become a Christian except for somebody speaking into your life. And you can look back and look at how God has orchestrated your circumstances by strategically placing people there along the way. If you became a child or Christian as a child, your parents, born in a Christian home, your parents led you to the Lord, you might think, well, that doesn't apply to me. Oh, yes, it does. Your parents were strategically placed, folks. There are billions of people around this world today who were not born in Christian homes. Your parents were strategically placed to lead you to Jesus. So this is a key principle. To turn it back around, where has God placed you? You know, some vocations are obvious. I'm a pastor. Maybe you're a nurse. You minister to people in very vulnerable places. Okay, but it doesn't matter what you do for a living or where you're at. If you're sensitive to what God is doing, you are strategically placed to be a vessel of mercy in the lives of others. Right now, in these musical projects, one of my musical projects, I'm in this band. Check this out. It's 5, 6 people in this band, and every one of the people in the band is a Christian, a committed Christian, except for one guy. Do you think that dude is set up? And if you'll please pray for me, I might see the light of it. No, just kidding. But it's so exciting because I just sit back and I just watch this all go down. This guy's done, man. He's in the kingdom. That's just all there is to it. It might be this week. It might be 10 years from now. It depends on where he's at. But God, is no accident that he's playing with 5 other believers in Jesus and actually enjoying it, which is kind of cool. I got a prayer request this morning. Part of this has to do with us actually living life with gospel eyes so that we see this stuff. Because if we don't, if we're all wrapped up in our own stuff, we'll go through life and not see how strategically we're placed. Here's a woman in our congregation who gets this. I'm sitting there at 4:30 in the morning. I woke up, excited about all the stuff going on today. Can't go back to sleep. I'm ditzing around, reading through my sermon, and then I check my email. And I get a prayer request from a young mom at OCF named Cheryl Koga. I think Cheryl might even be in this service. There she is right there. I didn't know I was going to embarrass her in this service. But here's her prayer request. She says, I'd like to ask for prayer for my friend's mom. Apparently this mother had a sudden, unanticipated health challenge. And then Cheryl writes, the friend is a coworker who I feel God has weaved into my life to share with her about the Lord. Cheryl sees how God has strategically placed her in this person's life and probably cultivated that relationship for a long, long time. And now, relationship and gospel eyes meet opportunity in the form of suffering, which is often the case. And God's work can happen in a person's life. Look at Naaman. Here, this little slave girl placed in his house opportunity in the form of suffering, his leprosy, and God begins to work his wonders. And this is often how this combination works out. I was befriending a guy who worked at a tackle shop for quite some time. He was this old retired guy who was basically just working there part-time for his wife wanted to get him out of the house. And he was a feisty old guy, a little Napoleon guy, and I just was befriending him, and I sort of saw a soft heart there, and no openness to spiritual things at all. Until one day, bam, he had a stroke and hit the ground in that tackle shop and was housebound and never got out. 3-4 years later, he died. And he's with the Lord now because opportunity, strategically placed, met suffering, and God had room to do his work. Now, let's turn this around a bit. What if the person who is suffering is not the person who you have an opportunity to minister to, but what if the person who is strategically placed, what if you are the one who is suffering? What if you are the one who is suffering? Well, the same principle applies. I want you to look at our passage, and I want you to look at verse 2. And if you're a parent, folks, this verse should smack you in the face. We just read through this Bible stuff and we don't just camp on it and reflect upon some of the implications. But look what happens. It says, now the Syrians on one of their raids had carried off a little girl from the land of Israel, and she worked in the service of Naaman's wife. What has happened here is typical of ancient warfare. 150 BC or so, the Greek Empire, right before the Romans, they were marching down to conquer the Jews. The Jews had rebelled against them in Palestine. And characteristic of ancient imperial armies, they didn't just bring soldiers and generals, they also brought slave traders along. Because these slave traders knew there was money to be made, because as they conquered these villages in Judea, they would enslave the occupants, take them and sell them and make a profit on them. And we see this again and again in ancient warfare. And here these Syrian raiders had come down. They had probably killed this little girl's parents, and they have taken her as a captive and enslaved her, and now she's in the service of the wife of the general who was in charge of the whole Syrian operation. And the interesting side point here is that this girl has enough sense to know that God's prophet Elisha could heal Naaman of his leprosy. And that's an odd thing, because remember, Israel has apostatized. What the Israelites are doing are not worshiping Yahweh, they're worshiping Baal. So she is a member of the remnant. She comes from a godly family, one of the few godly families left, but that didn't insulate her from the ravages of this raid. She's still taken captive. And in fact, if you think about it, folks, because of her godly family and her confidence in Yahweh, which was rare in Israel, she is probably one of the few people in Israel who God could have used to reach Naaman the Syrian. And this brings us to a point that is challenging, to say the least, and that is this, that people are often brought into the kingdom at great cost to other people. People are often brought into the kingdom at great cost to other people. If that makes you mad at God, then I can only point you to Jesus. Think how much it cost God, think how much it cost Jesus to bring you into the kingdom. And we see this again and again and again as we look through the scriptures. Think about back in Genesis, where Joseph is sold into slavery to preserve the whole nation of Israel. And when all is said and done, Joseph says to his brothers, "You meant it for bad, but God meant it for good." You meant it for bad, but God meant it for good. People are often brought into the kingdom at great cost to other people. What about the title of this book here? Can you guys read this from the back? John Piper, Don't Waste Your Cancer. Don't waste your... What's his point? Well, simply this. Your cancer, your heartache, your loss, whatever it might be, the challenges that life is throwing at you, provide a strategic opportunity for God to work his wonders in the lives of others. It certainly was the case for a girl who was kidnapped from her parents after they were likely killed by Syrian raiders. Wow. This is so far-reaching, just of a personal nature. There was a fellow 2,000 years ago. We know him as the Apostle Paul. And he had a really bad situation happen to him. Great cost to him. He's doing his thing, following God's will, planting churches, and he's arrested and charged with a capital offense and thrown in prison. Is going to be on trial for his life, doesn't know whether he's going to live or die. Talk about cost. And one of his little churches he'd started in this town called Philippi was really concerned about him. So they sent a dude named Epaphroditus with some money, for one thing, because these prisons in the ancient world didn't have cafeterias. You were basically relying on friends outside to keep you alive. And so they brought him some resources, and they were really concerned about him. And see, he wrote him a thank you letter in response, and he said something very, very interesting in this letter. You see, Paul had gospel eyes on. He knew that his situation was a strategic opportunity for God to work his wonders in the lives of others. Here's what he wrote. He says, Philippians 1:12, I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. What Paul's saying is exactly what was on the screen up there. It's a strategic opportunity for God to work his wonders in the life of others. And then Paul goes on and explains. He says, everybody in the Praetorian Guard has heard about Jesus. And not only that, but most of the Christians in Rome have become more bold to preach the gospel. And Paul sees this as a strategic opportunity. And you know, folks, Paul didn't see half of it, a third of it, a quarter of it, or even a tenth of it from his vantage point. And how do I know that? Well, 2,000 years some later, it's 1976, I just become a Christian. And I'd become a Christian through all this emotional anxiety and hassles that had started me on my spiritual quest. And after I became a Christian, that anxiety didn't go away overnight. I had to learn to trust in Jesus. And I went into my pastor and I asked him for some help, and he gave me a couple of verses from the book of Philippians. Philippians 4, verses 6 and 7. Be anxious for nothing, but in everything, with thanksgiving, with all prayer and supplication, let your requests be made known to God, and the peace of God, which passes all understanding, will guard your mind and your hearts in Christ Jesus. So I held on to that verse. It was my lifeline to sanity for the first year and a half or so of my Christian life. Folks, if Paul hadn't been thrown in prison and written the letter to the Philippian church, I never would have had that verse to hang on to for the first year and a half of my Christian life. And you think about the letters in your New Testament, we call them the prison epistles, Ephesians, Colossians, Philippians, 2 Timothy, that Paul wrote Philemon while he was in prison, that have ministered to people and brought people into the kingdom and allowed God to work his wonders in hundreds of thousands, literally millions of lives, all because of the suffering of one man. All because it was great cost to the Apostle Paul. So your life situation is a strategic opportunity for God to work his wonders in the life of others, and maybe even more so if life is tough for you right now. People are watching. People are listening. Secondly, stop feeling sorry for yourself and start feeling sorry for others. I mean, that's the key. See, if we go around focusing on ourselves, we don't see the opportunities that are there. We have to have gospel lenses on. We have to be other-centered. Paul could have sat in prison feeling really sorry for himself and not even seen what opportunities were there and what God was doing around him. And what is so remarkable to me about this passage is here this little slave girl who was taken captive, ripped out of her home, brought into a country where she didn't even know the language, and she actually feels compassion for the general who trashed her people. She says, would that my Lord were with the prophet who is in Samaria. He would cure him of his leprosy. This is a rebuke to me because I find myself, I'm barely able to generate compassion for my fellow Christians and people I like, let alone for people who have done me wrong. And yet here is this little slave girl whose compassion is overflowing for a guy that, from a human perspective, not from a gospel perspective, but from a human perspective, she should have no compassion at all for this guy. Finally, for Jesus' followers, come out of the closet. Come out of the closet. Folks, you can look around and see how strategically you are placed all day long. And you can have all these warm feelings and sympathy and compassion for people who are hurting around you. But if you do not open your mouth, they'll never know about Jesus. Some of you have seen this. Preach the gospel, use words if necessary. Really cute. And yes, there's a point there. We don't want to use words and not live out the gospel. That's the point here, isn't it? But this is a very dangerous life theme for a follower of Jesus. I would say that what the Bible challenges us to do is to preach the gospel, because using words is necessary, folks. Using words is necessary. Think about it, if this little girl, here she is, this little slave girl, in the home of this guy who's the man, he had success, he had status, he had plenty of stuff, he had public recognition, and she is bold enough to open her mouth and tell him about Yahweh and his prophet Elisha. And think about this with me for a second. If this little girl had not been bold enough to open her mouth, if she hadn't come out of the closet, so to speak, we wouldn't even have this chapter in our Bibles today. That's a pretty profound thought. So here's our challenge for those of us who are Jesus followers. This passage is one of the most profound passages in the Old Testament, challenging us to be other-centered and evangelistic in our lives. And let me just make one last comment before we talk about God-seekers here just for a minute, and that is this. If you look at that and you say, that ain't me, I'll just kind of keep coming to church on Sunday and do my thing, but that ain't me. That's for, people like Carlos and Brandon and, the elders. What you will destine yourself to is a very disappointing Christian life. Because, folks, this is why we have been left on this planet. We get to participate in a story that has been going on for thousands of years and is still being written through God's church and God's people today, and will culminate when Jesus returns for his church in the future. And to stand outside that story and tack on our Christian faith and just live life as if this is not life explains to me why so many Christians are so disappointed with Christianity. But boy, you get on board here and you begin to recognize that not just the good stuff, but even the bad stuff that happens to us strategically places us to be agents of the King of the universe, that people's lives might be changed forever. All of a sudden, life takes on meaning like you've never known it before. And that doesn't matter whether you're working at OCF as a pastor or you're working at the post office as a letter carrier. It's all the same when you get this stuff that's in our passage here today. All right, what about God seekers? If you're a God seeker here today, we welcome you. I was a God seeker, like I mentioned, for a whole year. And I looked and looked and looked. And here's what we discover in our passage about God seekers. First of all, God doesn't want your money. People think, the church just wants my money. Yeah, right, we don't need your money. Yeah, we got a lot of rich people here. Seriously, God does not want... Look what Naaman tries to do here. The first thing he does is he collects all this silver and gold and fancy clothes. And the commentators go, well, this is just an astronomical amount of money. He's basically going all in to get his leprosy healed. He's going down to try to buy it from God, God's prophet, see? Because this is how religion operates. This is how religion operated then. It's how religion operates today. It's not how Christianity operates. But it's how religion operated. Back in the ancient world, man, if you wanted God to do something for you, you first had to do something for God. So if you had some good-looking chick and you wanted her to notice you, man, you went down, to one of the temples in, Alexandria or Athens, and, you made sure you kept one of these gods happy, so maybe they'd change that girl's attitude toward you. Or if you were going to, make a voyage on the Mediterranean Sea, scary stuff. Man, you went to the temple of Poseidon. First you offered a sacrifice, because the whole deal of religion outside of the gospel of Jesus Christ is I do so that God will respond to me. God is this giant vending machine in the sky, see? And so the money that Naaman brings is really symbolic of everything you and I try to bring to the table to get God to do our bidding, and God will have no part of it at all. And this is so hard for us as human beings to get. In fact, in our passage, remember, even after Naaman is healed and he declares there's no other God but Yahweh, he still wants to give Elisha a present. But Elisha says, no way. We are not going to confuse God's gift of grace here. And we didn't read on in the passage, but the chapter ends with Elisha's servant Gehazi running after Naaman, trying to get the money himself. And when he does, God judges him and gives him leprosy, afflicts him with leprosy, because God will not have his grace compromised or the message clouded by any idea that somehow, because I'm a little better than this person, or because I'm a good person, or because I'm this or that, that somehow that earns me favor with the God who created me. No, we bring nothing to the table, folks. God doesn't want our money. All God wants is your whole life, and we'll get to that in a minute. But before we do, God's not impressed by your status. God's not impressed by your status. This is fun stuff. Verse 9, it says, Naaman came to Elisha with his horses and chariots. Okay, so here's Elisha. Elisha's a prophet, you know. Remember John the Baptist, you know, and he wearing all those funky clothes, and what was he eating? Locusts and wild honey and, you know, maybe a few crickets. Who knows what he's at. But, you know, Elisha doesn't have a, you know, fancy digs. He's probably living in, you know, the poor area of the town, whatever, in Israel and Samaria. And here comes this entourage. It's like, you know, Donald Trump and all the Secret Service. You know, everybody pulls up. You know, it's like down on Cypress Street where I live. You know, it's like this, if the president, no, everybody showed up on Cypress Street, you know. And here's this big entourage. And Naaman expects Elisha to come out at his bidding and lick his boots. And look what Elisha does. It's just great. Elisha sends a messenger to him. Doesn't even go out himself, sends a messenger. Okay, so you're at work on Tuesday, and you're working there away, and your secretary's there, and your secretary gets a call, and she picks it up, and she goes, starts looking like this, really worried. She looks over at you, goes, the boss wants to see you in the office right now. And you look at the secretary and go, oh, why don't you go and see what he wants? Tell him I'm busy. Yeah! Well, you multiply that by 100, and that's what you have here. And it comes out in the text when Naaman says, he was angry. He went away saying, behold, I thought he would surely come out to me. And that little to me in the Hebrew text is front-loaded for emphasis, something like this. Naaman was angry, went away saying, behold, I thought that to me he would surely come out. So what God has to do with God's seekers, what he did with me, is he has to cut us off at the knees where our pride is concerned, folks. And we have to recognize we have nothing. Money, status, we have nothing that we can leverage to somehow get an inside track with God. God loves us just like we are, no matter who we are. Now, the insult to Naaman's status is not the only thing he gets ticked off at. There is something that makes him even madder. Look at verse 12. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean? So he turned and went away in a rage. Isn't Buddhism, Islam, Hinduism equally valid pathways to God? What Naaman discovers here is that there is only one river of life. There is only one river of life, and it enrages him. And I am not surprised, because the exclusive claims of Yahweh, the exclusive claim of Jesus, I am the way, the truth, and the life, nobody comes to the Father apart from me, have enraged and angered people for 3,000 years. But this is how God set things up. Just think how silly it must have sounded to Naaman. Oh, go wash in that dirty old muddy Jordan, dip yourself 7 times, and God will heal you. That's about how silly it sounded to me when I began my quest as a God seeker. To have somebody tell me that some Jewish teacher who was crucified 2,000 years ago by some imperial army Romans could be the answer to my anxiety and my problems today. It made about as much sense as go take 7 dips in a river. But as it turned out, I went from river after river after river during that year and found no healing until I jumped in the Jordan of Jesus, and God began to heal me from the inside out. There is only one river of life. One river of life. You know, anybody know what that little deal is? It's not Snapchat. Notice it has wheels. Yep, you guys know. Yeah, we have some high-tech people, unlike me. The reason I know what that is because I ride to Biola with Brandon Cash, and Brandon Cash, only reason I let him ride in my truck is because he has a little cell phone with Wave on it, you know. Actually, we have a great time together. It's been a delight since he started out there to ride share out there. So he uses little ways to make sure we get on and off the freeway out most efficiently. But I had an experience with this that really kind of brings a point home here this morning. And here it is. So I was going to Pasadena. It was Joanne and I driving our truck and a bass player and his wife for a gig up there. And we're driving up that old 110 between, you know, L.A. and Pasadena up there, Arroyo Seco, the parkway there. It's real windy. And we're flying. There's hardly any traffic. And she's on the Waze. And, you know, I'm just thinking, well, we don't need that thing. And she goes, oh, hey, you guys, Waze is telling us to get off the freeway at the next on-ramp. There's a big traffic jam up here. And both myself and Bill, the bass player, was looking, yeah, right, this freeway's totally empty. It was Sunday afternoon, it's totally empty. So we just blew it off. The software's, we can't trust it. You know, we're not going to. We went around the corner, dead stop, right there, and learned our lesson. You just have to trust the software. Folks, here's the software, all right? And this is version 1.0, okay? There is no 1.1, 1.2. It was perfect the first time it came out. And as you're going along the freeway of life, if you don't trust the software, you'll come around the corner and there'll be quite a mess if you don't do what Naaman finally did and dip yourself in the one river of life, the river of Jesus. Finally, everything changes when you take that plunge. Everything changes when you take that plunge. We saw how, well, it's on your outline here. It bears reading again. Naaman says, "Behold, I know there's no God in all the earth but in Israel. Please let there be given to your servant 2 mule loads of earth. For from now on your servant will not offer burnt offering or sacrifice to any god but the Lord." This guy was sold out to Jesus. Oh, I thought Jesus was later in the Bible. You know that we discover as we look through the scriptures that Yahweh in the Old Testament, that's Jesus. That's Jesus. And Naaman, he is sold out. And this is something to keep in mind. I think in our efforts not to load works onto grace, what we don't emphasize is the fact that once somebody becomes a Christian, which is a free gift of God by His grace, it's basically an all-in proposition. There is no halfway. Everything changes when you take the plunge. Being involved in the fishing community over the years and now the music scene with these old dudes like me, I run into a lot of folks who would tell you they are alcoholics who have not had a drink in 15, 20, 25 years. One fellow in particular comes to mind. It's been very interesting because it's given me a whole window into the whole AA culture and scenario there, and maybe one of the reasons why AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, has been so successful in the lives of so many over the years. This fellow, I was on the boat with him and discovered that he hadn't had a drink in 25 years, and he's just doing great, awesome. Call himself, I'm an alcoholic, but I haven't had drink in 25 years. Then I discovered something about him. Here it is, 25 years later, after he took the plunge to get out of alcoholism, and he still goes to meetings 3 or 4 nights a week. And I was kind of puzzled by that, but I thought, well, don't you, quit drinking and then get some support, and then after, a year or two, you go back and you live life like you did before. Maybe not drinking, but, everything's kind of normal. No, what happens is if you are committed to stopping drinking or any addictive habit, your whole future life is going to change as a result. And for most people, that involves meetings night after night after night for the rest of your life. And this fellow was absolutely happy to do that because he saw the payoff. So it is for committing to Christ, folks. Everything changes. And we have you at church 5 nights a week. Just kidding, just kidding. But those of you who are genuine followers of Jesus know, especially if you became a Christian as an adult, your life is totally different. Your circles of friends are different. Your priorities are different. Your job may even be different. Everything changes when you take the plunge. And it's only fair to say that. But those of us who are followers of Jesus will tell you something if you're a God seeker. When everything changes, folks, it changes for the best, and it changes forever. Amen? Let's pray. Lord, thank you for this remarkable